I set out on the trail with the kind of energy that only comes from excitement. The mountain was quiet, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and the evening air was still. The weather had been perfect all day, and I was looking forward to catching the sunset from the ridge at the top. I'd heard it was one of the best views on this trail. So, I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and headed out just as the day started to dip. The trail was more rugged than I expected, but nothing too overwhelming. A few scrambles here and there, but manageable. I'd hiked tougher terrain before, so I wasn't worried. I knew I'd be back at the car in time to get some dinner and a cold beer, so I wasn't rushing. The time slipped away quickly. What started as a steady climb turned into something more challenging. The sun lowered, and shadows stretched long across the path. I checked my watch. It was later than I'd planned. A quick glance at the horizon told me I wouldn't make it to the ridge in time for the sunset. The sky was already beginning to shift into that rich, dusky purple. I could still catch the tail end of it, though, if I picked up my pace. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, determined to at least see some of it. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky was darkening fast, the last of the sunlight painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. I stopped to take it all in, the beauty of it almost overwhelming. But I knew I couldn't linger too long. I had to head back before it got too dark. I dug into my pack for the headlamp I always carried for situations like this. Clicked on, casting a small pool of light in front of me. I started down the trail, trying to retrace my steps, but the mountain at night was different. Every tree, every rock, seemed unfamiliar. It was as if the landscape had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. The air had turned cold, and the silence was profound. No wind, no wildlife stirring, just the steady crunch of my boots on the dry leaves beneath me. I checked my watch again. Over an hour had passed since I'd reached the ridge. I hadn't meant to get so caught up in the view, but now it was too late to worry about that. The light was fading quickly, and the trail was getting harder to follow. The path, which had seemed so clear when I was hiking up, now seemed to wind and twist in strange ways, like the forest was playing tricks on me. Then something caught my eye, a trail marker. It was yellow, the same color as the others I had passed, but for some reason I didn't remember seeing it before. I paused, squinting into the darkness. I must have missed it when I passed by earlier. No big deal, I thought. I was just getting turned around in the dark. But something felt off. I looked around for another marker. Nothing. It was just that one. I checked my map, trying to orient myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention, but the path didn't look like the one I had hiked up earlier. I retraced my steps to where the marker was, trying to figure out how I had missed it. Nothing made sense. Panic started to creep in. I checked the map again, double-checking everything. My starting point was supposed to be just a few miles back, and I hadn't seen any forks in the trail. But now, as I looked at the map under the dim light of my headlamp, I realized something. I had gone off course. The trail I had been following wasn't the one I had started on. Somehow, I had veered off the main path and into the woods. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I quickly turned around, trying to get back to the main trail, but it felt like the woods were closing in on me. The trees, the rocks, the ground, all of it seemed wrong. The markers, the ones I thought I'd been following, weren't guiding me back to my car. They were just there, scattered, leading nowhere I recognized. My heart started to race. I checked the markers again. Maybe I had just made a mistake, but the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. Each new marker I found didn't lead me back the way I'd come. It only took me deeper into the woods. I started walking faster, my boots scraping over the dry leaves. The trail was becoming indistinct, hard to follow. I couldn't tell if I was going in circles or if the forest itself was changing around me, but everything felt wrong. I checked my map again, but the trail on it didn't match the one beneath my feet. Nothing made sense, and then I heard it. At first, it was faint, like the rustle of wind, but there was no wind. I stopped, listening, straining to hear. A whisper, a voice. Was it someone else out here with me? I held my breath, hoping to hear something else, to confirm I wasn't imagining it. But the whisper came again, this time clearer, though still indistinct. My heart pounded in my chest. I was sure I wasn't alone anymore. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the flickering light of my headlamp. I told myself it was just my imagination. The trail was messing with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I walked faster, stumbling over roots and rocks, trying to stay calm. The whispers continued, now louder, but still impossible to make out. They seemed to surround me, drifting from all directions. My pulse raced. I wanted to yell, to call out, but something kept me quiet. Something kept me still. Then I saw it, another marker. Only this one was different. It wasn't the same bright yellow color. It was dull, almost faded, and there was something strange about the way it was placed. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I was sure I hadn't seen this one before. I stared at it for a long time, too scared to move. The whispers were growing louder now, so loud I could almost hear my name being called. But no one was there. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. The voices, the markers, the way the woods had shifted around me. It was like I was being led somewhere I didn't want to go. I turned away from the marker, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. I had to get back on track. I had to find my way out of the woods before I lost my mind completely. But as I turned, I realized the truth. The trail markers were leading me somewhere, but it wasn't the trail. It wasn't the way back. I didn't know where they were leading me, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't safe. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever was drawing me deeper into the woods. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices, clear and insistent, calling my name, pulling at my sanity. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. Couldn't stop, couldn't listen. I ran through the trees, my headlamp bouncing wildly. The world around me a blur of shadows and light. My feet slammed against the ground, the thud of my boots deafening in the silence of the forest. But the voices didn't stop. They followed me, growing louder and louder, filling my mind until I couldn't think of anything else. And then, finally, I saw it. The break in the trees. The car. I had made it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward my vehicle, the light from the headlights flashing across the trees. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't care to see if anything was following me. I just threw my pack into the back seat and slammed the door. I sat there, shaking, for what felt like hours, but I eventually found the strength to start the engine. As I pulled away from the trailhead, I didn't look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Something had been waiting for me to find those markers, to follow them, and to step deeper into the woods. The trail was still there. The woods still stood in silence. But I would never return. I didn't care to know what lay beyond the markers. Whatever it was, I wasn't meant to find it. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the forest around me was wrapped in darkness. I had been hiking for a few hours, and my headlamp cast a faint, narrow beam ahead of me. Normally, hiking at night didn't bother me. In fact, I had always found solace in the quiet, the crisp air, and the feeling of being utterly alone with nature. Most people avoid the woods at night, but for me, it was where I felt the most comfortable. No distractions, no crowds, just me and the trees. I had hiked this trail before, but tonight, I decided to take a new route, one that cut deeper into the woods, winding its way through thick brush and dense undergrowth. The new trail, from what I had heard, led to an abandoned cabin hidden far from the main paths. People in town had mentioned it in hushed tones, sharing rumors about strange occurrences near the cabin. It didn't seem like anything more than stories to me. I wasn't one to get spooked by campfire tales or half-baked myths, so I decided to go see the cabin for myself. Besides, it would make for an interesting detour before heading back to the trailhead. The first few miles were uneventful, the trail barely visible under the canopy of towering trees. The air smelled damp, a mixture of pine and decaying leaves. As I hiked, the sounds of the forest at night wrapped around me. Rustling leaves, distant calls from owls, the occasional scurry of something small in the underbrush. Everything felt normal, calm, just as it always did when I hiked at night. Eventually, I reached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be. It appeared out of the shadows like a silhouette, its dilapidated frame barely visible against the backdrop of the forest. The roof sagged, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of moss and ivy. I stopped a few feet away, my light casting eerie shadows on the cabin's decaying structure. There were no windows, only darkened holes where glass had once been, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I didn't expect much. I figured it would just be a rundown shack, maybe a few old pieces of furniture left inside to rot. But as I stood there, I heard something. A faint sound that barely reached my ears over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It was a low murmur, almost like someone was speaking softly inside the cabin. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out any shapes through the broken door, but I saw nothing. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps some critter moving around inside the cabin. There were plenty of animals that might have made a noise like that. A squirrel, a raccoon, maybe even a fox. Nothing to be alarmed about. I shrugged it off and began to walk away, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path the only noise in the stillness. But then, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. The sound was unmistakable. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The unmistakable noise of someone walking on the same gravel path I was on, keeping perfect pace with me. I turned quickly, expecting to see another hiker behind me. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail, but that didn't mean there wasn't someone out here. The trail was remote, but it wasn't entirely deserted. However, when I looked, there was no one there. The path behind me was empty, the shadows stretching in every direction, with no sign of anyone following me. My heart began to beat a little faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I was alone out here. It was just me and the forest. I took a deep breath and shook my head, trying to push away the growing sense of unease. Maybe I was hearing things. The wind had picked up a little, and the trees were swaying more vigorously now. It was possible that the sounds I'd heard had just been my mind playing tricks on me. I turned back to face the cabin, my eyes scanning the dark doorway once again. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I looked harder, there was nothing. I felt a strange twinge of uncertainty in my gut. Still, I forced myself to keep moving forward, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer, more distinct. It was as if someone had moved right behind me, their presence so near that I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. I froze. There was no mistaking it now. The footsteps were right behind me, growing louder with each passing second, slowly closing the distance. I quickly glanced over my shoulder again. Still no one. But then I saw it. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't fully illuminated, but the faint light from my headlamp revealed just enough to make it out. A silhouette, tall and thin, its features indistinct but still there. It stood perfectly still, its body partially hidden by the frame of the door, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. And then it smiled. The grin that spread across its face wasn't a friendly one. The teeth were long and sharp, yellowed with age, a jagged mess that looked too wide for a normal human mouth. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill racing down my spine, a grin that seemed to mock me, like it knew I had been watching and knew how afraid I had become. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my chest tightening as I stared at the figure. It wasn't human. I couldn't place why, but something about it was wrong. The way it stood there, unmoving with that grotesque smile, sent a wave of terror over me. Before I could react, the figure disappeared into the darkness inside the cabin, moving so quickly and silently that it was as if it had melted into the shadows. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I hadn't heard it leave, hadn't seen it move. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what that thing was or why it was there, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I turned on my heel and started to walk away as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to drag me down. As I hurried back down the trail, I could still hear the footsteps behind me, the sound of someone or something moving just out of sight. Every few steps, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The forest was still silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the soft hoot of an owl. I reached the point where the trail split, the familiar path that led me back toward the main trailhead. The footsteps had stopped, but I didn't slow down. My body was on autopilot, my mind too fogged with fear to think straight. I didn't want to be anywhere near that cabin. I didn't want to be in this part of the forest anymore. I needed to get out. It wasn't until I reached my car, parked at the trailhead, that I allowed myself to stop and take a breath. The silence of the parking lot was almost unbearable after the tension of the woods. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking, and unlocked the door. I got inside quickly, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I sat there for a long time, just trying to calm myself down, trying to make sense of what had happened. The figure in the cabin, it hadn't been a person. I knew that now. It had moved too quickly, too unnaturally. I had heard the footsteps, heard them getting closer, but I had never seen anyone. And when I looked into that dark doorway, the figure had been wrong. Too wrong. I don't know what it was, but I don't want to go back there to find out. I left that night, never looking back at the cabin or the woods. There were no more footsteps, no more figures in the dark. But I don't feel the same about hiking at night anymore. That place is out there, and whatever I saw in that doorway, I can't forget it. The sun had just dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the trail. The high-altitude hike had been peaceful, and the air, thin as it was, felt fresh as I breathed it in, the coolness of the evening starting to settle in. I was hiking solo, as I often did, embracing the silence that only the mountains could offer. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of the wind whispering through the pines. It was the kind of solitude I relished, the kind that wrapped around me like a blanket. I had been hiking for hours, and I was deep into the backcountry now. The trail was steep in parts, but manageable. My backpack felt light, and I kept my pace steady, adjusting my position with every step as I moved deeper into the wilderness. This was my element, the mountains, the wilds, the unknown that stretched out in every direction. I wasn't afraid. I trusted the land and my knowledge of it. By the time the sky turned a darker shade of blue, I was nearing a section of the trail known for its switchbacks, a part of the hike I'd been dreading. But as night settled, I felt a peace come over me. There's something about being alone in nature at night that clears your mind, that connects you to the world in a way the daylight never could. The light from the moon filtered through the trees above, casting faint silver streaks across the trail. I stopped for a moment to take a drink from my water bottle and adjusted the straps on my pack. The quiet of the night was almost too much, but in the best way possible. It was a soothing silence, the kind that felt natural. I continued on, feeling my boots crunch against the gravel. The trail narrowed here, winding through a dense thicket of trees. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and the path seemed to lead deeper into the woods, away from everything. I pushed forward, my footsteps becoming the only sound in the dark. That's when it started. A subtle shift in the air, a change I couldn't quite explain, but that set the hairs on the back of my neck standing. Something wasn't right. I stopped, glancing around, thinking it was just the normal sounds of the wilderness. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind playing tricks. But as I stood still, a thought crept into my mind. It wasn't the trees shifting. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly turned in a circle, listening intently. The night was still, too still. Not even the usual chirping of crickets. I swallowed hard, brushing the feeling aside. Probably just a deer or a squirrel, I thought, trying to calm myself. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, pressing on the edges of my awareness like a shadow. I glanced back over my shoulder, the trail behind me stretching empty and silent. But something caught my eye. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the moonlight's reach, I saw something. A figure. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was standing there, unmoving at the very edge of the darkness, just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a shape. But it was enough. A shape, still and silent, watching me. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Could it be another hiker? I hadn't passed anyone for hours, but it was possible. Maybe they were waiting for me to pass. I was alone out here, after all, and hikers often space themselves out on the trail. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a rock or a tree stump had tricked my eyes. I didn't know. I turned back to face forward, my feet still planted firmly on the ground. But the feeling, that heavy, nagging sensation, wouldn't leave me. I kept walking, my steps slower now, more deliberate, as if the trail had somehow grown heavier beneath me. The figure behind me didn't move. I tried to focus on my breathing, to ground myself in the present, but the silence was oppressive, as if the whole forest had been holding its breath. And then I heard it, a voice, soft, barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. Emily. My heart lurched. The voice sounded so close, too close. I stopped dead in my tracks, spinning around with a jolt of adrenaline flooding my veins. My eyes darted toward the place where the figure had been standing. It wasn't there anymore. The trail behind me was empty. I stood frozen for a few moments, trying to make sense of what just happened. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I hadn't been sleeping well recently, and the isolation of the trail could mess with my head. I was still adjusting to the altitude. Maybe it was just exhaustion, but something told me it wasn't that simple. Something wasn't right. I started walking again, my pace picking up as my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't shake. The figure was gone, but that whisper, that voice was still echoing in my mind. As I moved through the trees, the trail opened up again to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a valley. The view was breathtaking, the moon casting long shadows over the terrain below. It was beautiful, peaceful, and yet there was a weight in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to push the unease down, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Then I heard it again, even softer this time. Emily. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. This time I saw it. The figure was there, just at the edge of the tree line, standing still, staring at me. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was large, its shape all wrong, like a distorted human figure, but too tall, too wide. Its silhouette was blurry, like it was partly out of focus, and it seemed to blend into the darkness in a way that made my stomach drop. And it was closer now, much closer. A cold chill ran through me, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It hadn't moved, not that I could see, but somehow it was closer. I turned to run, my legs burning as I sprinted down the trail, my mind filled with nothing but the desperate urge to get away. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how far I ran, the feeling of being watched never left. It was like the ground beneath me was shifting, pulling me back toward that thing, that presence that had been following me. I don't know how long I ran. My feet felt like lead, my body exhausted from the stress, but I didn't dare stop. Couldn't. Not until I was far, far away from whatever it was that had been stalking me through the trees. When I finally found myself at a fork in the trail, the dense forest breaking apart into a small clearing, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I turned back, my eyes scanning the dark trees behind me. The trail stretched out behind me, but there was nothing, no figure, no movement. I sat there for a long time, my breath slow and shaky, my body still trembling from the fear that had gripped me. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know what that figure had been, or what had been watching me. But I knew one thing. It was still out there. I didn't wait around. I gathered myself together, still shaken but determined, and I started walking again, faster now, leaving the trail I'd been following for hours behind me. Whatever that thing was, whatever had been out there in the trees, it wasn't something I could understand, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that I wasn't going to let it catch me. I didn't stop until I made it to the next trailhead, where I finally found a small group of other hikers, their campfire flickering in the distance. I could still feel that sensation of being watched, the chill of it in my bones, but the trail behind me was empty, and I didn't go back. I never hiked that section again. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that you only get when the world around you is shut off completely. There were no sounds from the usual night creatures, no chirping insects, no distant calls from animals, just the faint rustle of the wind brushing the trees, the sort of noise that you could almost convince yourself wasn't really there. I had decided to take a night hike. It wasn't something I normally did, but I'd been feeling restless and needed a break from everything. The forest park was only a short drive away from my apartment, and I figured the darkness would bring a kind of peace I couldn't find at home. The idea of being alone in the woods, with nothing but the beams from my headlamp to guide me, had a certain appeal to it. The trail was well marked and easy to follow, even in the dark. My headlamp illuminated the dirt path in front of me, the light bouncing off the trees around me in long, jagged shadows. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the night sky nearly pitch black. The more I walked, the quieter it became, and the air grew cooler, making my breath visible in short bursts as I exhaled. I wasn't worried, not yet. I'd hiked in the woods many times before. The peacefulness of it was almost soothing, and I started to settle into my rhythm. The trees were dense, their branches knitting together above me like a ceiling, shutting out any view of the stars. The only thing that existed now was the path, the beam of my headlamp, and the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A dim light flickered in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of my own headlamp bouncing off a branch or some reflective surface. But it was too far ahead, just beyond the reach of my light. It didn't flicker like a car's headlights, and it wasn't the steady beam of another hiker's lamp. This was different. It had the soft, uncertain glow of a lantern, moving slightly as though carried by someone. My curiosity piqued, and I slowed my pace, trying to figure out where the light was coming from. My eyes scanned the forest ahead, but there was nothing. I could barely make out the shadows between the trees, but the light had vanished, leaving nothing but the thick shadows of the woods. I wasn't sure what to think. Could have been someone else hiking the trail, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't passed anyone when I started, and the trail was so remote that it was unlikely someone would be this far out at this hour. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe it was an animal or something else, some trick of the light. I pressed on, ignoring the small knot of unease in my stomach. A part of me wanted to believe it was nothing, that it was my mind playing tricks in the dark. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I walked forward, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, the air around me seemed to shift, like the atmosphere had become heavier. I was only a few yards from where I had seen the light, but when I looked again, it was back. The light flickered again, and this time it was closer, much closer. It wasn't just a faint glow anymore. It looked solid, almost too real to be a figment of my imagination. My heart started to race, but my legs moved forward, almost against my better judgment. I had to see what it was. There was no way I was going to let this go, not now. I was close enough to make out the shape, but there was something strange about it. It wasn't high up, like someone holding a lantern. It was lower, almost like it was sitting on the ground. And it moved, just slightly, like it was being gently pushed by the wind. I quickened my pace, my breath catching in my throat. My headlamp flickered for a split second, and the light ahead of me flickered in time with it. I pushed harder, the sound of my boots hitting the dirt path louder in the still night air. I reached out for it, but just as I was about to close the distance, the light blinked out. Just like that, it was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space where the light had been. My mind raced as I looked around, trying to make sense of it. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, no sounds of movement. The silence was overwhelming. I stood still, straining to hear anything at all. But there was nothing. The only noise was the steady thrum of my heartbeat in my ears. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was some weird trick of the dark, my mind playing with me after being surrounded by nothing but trees and shadows for so long. I laughed softly at myself, shaking my head. I turned around to head back to the trail, telling myself that I was being silly, but that's when I saw it again. The light was back, even closer this time. It hovered just out of my reach, flickering like it was taunting me. The glow was faint, barely visible at first, but it was unmistakable. This time, I didn't hesitate. I bolted toward it, my body moving faster than I'd planned, desperate to catch it, to figure out what was going on. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted, my headlamp bouncing erratically with each stride. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much ground I covered, the light stayed just out of reach. It was always the same distance ahead, never moving closer, never fading away entirely. I reached out, hoping to grab it, but my fingers brushed against nothing. The fear started to bubble up inside me, and my instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to get out of the woods. But I kept going, the absurdity of the situation pushing me forward. The air around me felt colder, heavier, and I could feel my nerves tightening with every step. My body was screaming at me to stop, but I didn't. I had to know. What was that light? Why was it following me? Just as I was about to call out, to ask if anyone else was out here, the light vanished again. The darkness swallowed me whole, and my breath caught in my throat. I froze, standing in pitch-black silence, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just the light that vanished, though. Something else was gone. The forest around me. The noise, the life that had been so constant moments before, had fallen completely still. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, as though even the wind had stopped moving. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a whisper sliced through the night air. It was so quiet that I could hear it clearly, like a voice spoken just behind me, close enough to touch. The voice was low, almost a breath, but there was no mistaking it. Mark. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The name sounded wrong, as if it wasn't my own name being spoken, but something that had taken it and twisted it. My legs felt weak, and the fear that had been simmering inside me now flooded my body, turning my blood to ice. I turned slowly, my headlamp sweeping through the darkness, but there was nothing. No one. It wasn't possible. I had to be imagining it. The panic rising in my chest was real, though. I took a step back, almost stumbling, as the darkness seemed to press in around me, swallowing the path ahead. My headlamp flickered again, and I cursed under my breath as I tried to adjust it, but the flickering wouldn't stop. I slapped it, trying to get the beam steady, but the shadows only deepened, and the whispering started again. Mark! I snapped my head to the side, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the ground was empty. The only thing I could hear was my own frantic breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my headlamp dimming as the battery drained. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was suffocating, but there was something even worse. The realization that I was alone, that no one was out here, and that whatever it was that had been following me wasn't human. Without thinking, I spun around and started running. I couldn't remember the path. The trees seemed to shift, the trail narrowing and widening in ways that didn't make sense. I ran, faster than I ever had before, my mind focused only on getting out, on escaping the grip of the woods and whatever was out there with me. I didn't stop running until I hit the road, gasping for breath, my chest heaving with the effort. My headlamp had gone out completely. The only light now was from the distant streetlights. I collapsed on the shoulder, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again. The whisper, my name, the light, the fear. I'd made it out of the woods, but I wasn't sure the woods had let me go. had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the stillness of the woods at night, the cool air brushing my skin, and the feeling of being completely alone with my thoughts. No distractions, no noise, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I had hiked this trail hundreds of times before, and I knew every twist, every turn, and every dip in the ground. The trail was well worn, a path I'd become intimately familiar with. It was my favorite escape, my retreat from the noise of everyday life. On this particular night, I had set out later than usual. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light filtering through the trees, casting long, jagged shadows on the forest floor. I loved the way the trail felt under the moonlight, almost ethereal, like something from a dream. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as small animals scurried through the underbrush. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine was thick in the air. It felt peaceful, like nothing could go wrong. I had been hiking for about an hour, the trail winding its way deeper into the woods. As I walked, I thought about everything and nothing all at once. Hiking alone always gave me space to clear my head. But tonight, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint at first, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the late hour, or maybe I was tired from a long day. I pushed forward, deciding to press on until I reached the overlook at the end of the trail. The view from there was always worth the trek. But as I moved forward, I started hearing something. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was imagining it. The softest sound of footsteps behind me, echoing through the stillness. My heart rate didn't increase at first. It was probably another hiker, someone on the same trail. It wasn't unusual to cross paths with someone else out here, especially on a well-known path. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing but the thick trees and the moonlight dancing across the ground. I quickened my pace, feeling the wind bite at my cheeks, but I didn't turn around again. The footsteps continued, now a little clearer, a little closer. I told myself it was nothing, just a fellow hiker, perhaps. Maybe they had been following me for a while and I hadn't noticed until now. That happens sometimes. But as the sound grew louder, something began to gnaw at the back of my mind. The footsteps were too in sync with my own, too soft but deliberate, as if someone was mimicking my exact pace. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the creeping sensation in my chest. No reason to panic. Still, I started walking faster. Maybe whoever was behind me just wanted to pass. Maybe they were catching up. But as I quickened my pace, so did they. The footsteps matched my speed perfectly, as if they were right on my heels. I glanced over my shoulder again. The trail was still empty, just the dark, towering trees stretching into the shadows, their branches creaking in the wind. I couldn't see anyone. No one was there. My stomach tightened. My instinct told me to keep moving. Something wasn't right. I started walking faster, my breath coming quicker as my heart rate picked up. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close that I could almost feel the presence, a weight in the air, like someone was walking just inches away. Every time I moved, they moved. Every step I took, they took. It wasn't possible. No one could be that close without me hearing them or seeing them. I started to panic, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My legs felt heavy, like I was trudging through thick mud, but I pushed myself faster, my boots pounding against the earth in a frantic rhythm. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, but still, when I turned around, the trail was empty. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, but there was no sign of another person. I looked to my left and right, but the dense woods offered no answers. The path stretched ahead, dark and endless, and I knew I had to get out of there. My heart raced as I started to sprint. I didn't know why I felt this way, why I couldn't just keep walking, but I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, like something was wrong, something was following me. The air was cold against my skin, my breath coming in sharp bursts. My boots pounded against the trail, kicking up loose gravel and dirt as I sprinted. The footsteps kept pace with me, still too close, matching my every stride. I could hear them now, the soft crunch of leaves, the brush of twigs, so close I could almost feel them. My lungs burned as I pushed myself faster, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Was it just my imagination? Was I overreacting? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to get to the trailhead, get to the end where the path opened up into a clearing. The darkness in the trees was closing in around me, the shadows stretching and warping with every step I took. The sound of the footsteps behind me was louder now, almost deafening. I could hear the crunching of leaves, the snapping of branches as they matched my every move. I pushed myself harder, my body aching, but I had no choice. I had to run. The trail seemed endless, and yet the end didn't come. Every time I thought I was almost there, the trail would twist, and the woods would stretch further ahead. It was as if the trail itself was never going to end. My breath was ragged, my legs screaming, but I kept running, faster and faster, until my muscles burned with the effort. Finally, I saw the lights of the trailhead up ahead, the familiar clearing where the trail met the parking lot. The end was in sight. My legs felt like jelly, but I pushed through, the sound of the footsteps right on top of me now, almost a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match my heartbeat. I could barely think straight as I reached the edge of the clearing, my mind whirling with confusion and fear. I didn't dare stop. Couldn't. Not yet. I sprinted into the open space, my heart racing. I didn't look back until I reached the edge of the parking lot. When I did, my eyes scanned the path, the trees, the clearing behind me. There was nothing. No one. The trail was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, leaving me feeling shaky and weak. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The footsteps, the feeling of being followed, the urgency that had gripped me, the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. It didn't make sense. If there had been someone behind me, they would have caught up. They would have passed me. But there was no one. The trail was empty, as it had always been. I stood there for a few more minutes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My mind kept going back to the footsteps, the feeling of someone being so close. It was as if they had been right behind me, yet when I had turned around, no one was ever there. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the unease still lingered, crawling under my skin. Eventually, I grabbed my water bottle from my backpack, trying to steady my nerves. It wasn't the first time I'd felt fear on a hike, but this time was different. There was something about it that I couldn't shake. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, and yet seeing nothing. It was the kind of fear that settled deep in your chest, the kind that didn't let go. I told myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had been too focused on the solitude, too wrapped up in my own thoughts. Maybe the shadows in the trees had seemed closer than they really were, and my imagination had run wild. Whatever it was, I had made it out. I was safe. I was alone. But as I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something had been following me, even if I couldn't see it. Something that I couldn't explain, something that felt all too real. The woods were silent once again, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back.